On a luxurious first-class flight, a flight attendant approached, her voice cold. "You're in the wrong seat." But the black woman seated there simply smiled. They had no idea who she was. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss what happens next. The Carter Airways private jet gleamed under the afternoon sun, preparing for its journey from New York to London. Not just anyone could set foot on this flight. This wasn't an ordinary commercial airline. It was a symbol of power and privilege, a place where top business moguls, politicians, celebrities, and the elite sat together, sipping 20-year-old champagne and enjoying world-class service reserved only for the ultra-wealthy. Every passenger boarding the plane had their own story, but they all shared one thing in common. They looked like they belonged here. From their custom-tailored Italian suits, Chanel or Hermes dresses, to glimmering Rolex watches, every detail silently confirmed their status. Karen Sterling, the head flight attendant, stood at the entrance of the cabin, her face glowing with a polite but selective smile, her sharp eyes lighting up whenever she saw a familiar face. With nearly 15 years of experience serving in first class, she prided herself on her ability to recognize who truly belonged the moment she laid eyes on them. "Welcome aboard, Mr. and Mrs. Winslow. Another trip to London? We will ensure your comfort as always." Karen bowed slightly to the Winslow couple, a powerful banking family who had been loyal passengers for over a decade. Mrs. Winslow, a graceful elderly woman, gave a faint smile before walking past her, her diamond-encrusted fingers barely acknowledging the greeting. "Mr. Langley, an honor to serve you again, sir." Karen's enthusiasm didn't wane as she greeted David Langley, a self-made billionaire in the tech industry. Langley nodded curtly, exchanging a few polite words before stepping into the first-class cabin, where cream-colored Italian leather seats, polished walnut dining tables, and glasses of Merlot wine awaited their elite passengers. Everything seemed to be going perfectly until a different kind of passenger boarded the plane. Alexis Carter, a black woman, walked up the aisle with an air of quiet confidence, though she neither flaunted wealth nor sought attention. She was dressed in an emerald green blazer, crisp white blouse, and fitted black slacks, paired with sophisticated yet understated heels. Nothing like the flashy designer labels typically seen in first class. Karen's smile disappeared immediately. She did not recognize this woman. Not a frequent flyer, not a celebrity, not a politician, not adorned in dazzling jewelry or carrying an ostentatious designer handbag. She did not look like she belonged here. Karen's demeanor instantly changed. Her polite warmth was replaced by an expression of skepticism and discomfort. "Hello." Karen hesitated, her sharp eyes scanning Alexis from head to toe. Alexis simply nodded briefly, her lips pressed into a thin line as if she were all too familiar with this type of scrutiny. "Excuse me, ma'am. May I see your ticket?" Karen's tone was neither friendly nor neutral, but carried an unmistakable air of authority. The surrounding passengers began to glance over. A few murmured quietly. Some deliberately looked away, unwilling to involve themselves. Alexis remained composed, reaching into her handbag and handing over the ticket without a word. Karen grabbed the ticket, her brows furrowing as she read the bold print, "First class, seat 2A." She couldn't believe her eyes. "Are you sure?" Karen's eyebrows lifted with an almost sarcastic surprise. Alexis didn't flinch. "Are you suggesting I bought the wrong ticket?" she asked, her voice calm but cutting. Karen felt uneasy. Why was this woman so composed? "I just need to double-check. Are you certain you're in the right cabin?" David Langley, who had been observing the interaction from his seat, shifted uncomfortably. He had flown dozens of times in first class, but he had never seen the head flight attendant check someone's ticket like this, unless, of course, they didn't look like they belonged. Mrs. Winslow, now comfortably seated, gave a side glance toward Alexis, then whispered to her husband. Perhaps she won an upgrade through some promotion. Her tone was tinged with suspicion. Karen wasn't done. "Wait a moment, I need to verify this with the check-in desk," she said, her tone growing icier. Alexis showed no reaction, merely settling into her seat with effortless grace. Karen stormed toward the galley, grabbing the in-flight phone and dialing ground control. I need confirmation on a first-class passenger. What's the issue? A woman who doesn't look like a VIP is seated in first class. Name: Alexis Carter. There was a brief silence on the other end. Then the voice replied in an incredulous tone, Karen, do you realize who you're talking about? Someone who shouldn't be here. Karen snapped, but then her face froze as she heard the response. She owns the airline. Karen felt her stomach drop. She had just made the biggest mistake of her career, but she had no idea just how catastrophic it was going to be. Meanwhile, Alexis calmly sent a message from her phone. A storm was coming, and Karen Sterling was about to be at the center of it. The injustice on Flight 787. Tension in the air. Karen Sterling's heart pounded as she hung up the phone. The words from the airline's ground control office still echoed in her ears. She owns the airline. A part of her refused to believe it. Alexis Carter, the black woman sitting in first class, didn't look like the owner of a multi-billion-dollar airline. She wasn't dripping in diamonds. She didn't have the recognizable face of a celebrity. She wasn't carrying a Birkin bag or wearing a designer gown. Karen clenched her jaw, her pride refusing to admit she had made a mistake. There was no way she would let this woman humiliate her. Instead of returning with an apology, she adjusted her uniform, lifted her chin, and marched back down the aisle with even more authority than before. Passengers stopped their conversations as she approached Alexis again. This time, Karen's voice was louder, sharper, more condescending. Miss Carter, I'm going to have to ask you to move to the back of the plane. A hush fell over the cabin. Alexis blinked slowly, her gaze steady. Why? Karen's lip curled slightly, as if she was holding back a smirk. Because first class is reserved for verified passengers. If you refuse to comply, I will have to call security. Alexis didn't flinch. Instead, she closed her book slowly, exhaled, and leaned back into her seat. Call them. The challenge hung in the air. Passengers shifted uncomfortably. Some pretended to ignore the situation. Others watched with a mix of curiosity and unease. The elderly Mrs. Winslow whispered to her husband, Some people just don't understand boundaries. The businessman across the aisle frowned. She already showed you her ticket. Karen's face darkened, but she refused to back down. She turned sharply to Grace, the younger flight attendant standing nervously nearby. Escort this passenger to economy, now. Grace hesitated, her fingers gripping the passenger list so tightly that her knuckles turned white. She knew this was wrong, but Karen's ice-cold stare warned her that any resistance would cost her job. Grace swallowed. Miss Carter, if you could just follow me. Alexis didn't move. Let me be clear, she said, her voice calm but cutting. I'm not moving, and if you put your hands on me, you will regret it. Karen's face twisted in frustration. You people always think. She stopped herself, but the damage was done. A few passengers gasped. The businessman across the aisle leaned forward aggressively, his voice tight with anger. Excuse me? What do you mean, you people? Karen ignored him, her hands clenched into fists, her nails digging into her palms as she fought to maintain control of the situation. She would not be embarrassed by this woman, not here, not in front of her wealthy passengers. She needed to remind Alexis of her place, and so Karen did something unthinkable. She reached down, grabbed Alexis's handbag from the seat beside her, and tossed it onto the floor. If you belong here, prove it. Gasps rippled through the cabin. For a brief moment, everything was silent. Then, Alexis rose slowly from her seat. She didn't yell. She didn't curse. She didn't show anger. Her composure was terrifying. She adjusted her blazer, dusted off her sleeve, and stared Karen down with a look that could cut steel. You just made the worst mistake of your career. The breaking point. Karen swallowed hard. Something shifted in the air. The businessman across the aisle took out his phone, his fingers moving quickly to start recording. Mrs. Winslow sat stiffly, pretending to be uninterested, but her eyes flickered nervously between Alexis and Karen. The entire first-class cabin was now watching. Alexis slowly bent down, picked up her handbag with grace, and took her seat again without breaking eye contact with Karen. "I'd like my drink now," she said calmly. Karen hesitated. For the first time, doubt crept into her mind. She glanced at Grace, who was still frozen in place, staring at Alexis like she had just watched someone flip the entire power structure of the plane upside down. Karen knew she had lost control, and she hated it, so she did something even worse. Karen grabbed a glass of water, walked to Alexis's seat, and instead of handing it to her properly, she tilted the glass just enough to let the water spill onto Alexis's lap. There were audible gasps. "Oh, I'm so sorry," Karen said mockingly. The businessman stood up from his seat abruptly, his voice sharp. "Are you insane?" Karen turned to him, her mask of politeness slipping completely. "Stay out of this." The businessman pulled out his phone and zoomed in on her name tag. "Oh, don't worry, sweetheart, I won't." Karen's breath hitched. The nosy socialite leaned forward, whispering to her friend, "She's really doing all this on camera?" Alexis calmly took a napkin, dabbed at the water on her lap, then picked up her phone. Karen's stomach twisted. "What are you doing?" Alexis didn't even look at her. Finishing this, she sent a single message. A moment later, the plane's intercom crackled to life. The captain's voice boomed through the speakers. "Flight crew, report to the cockpit immediately." Karen froze. The businessman smirked. Mrs. Winslow's knitting needles paused in midair. Grace let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. Karen felt her entire world crumble as she realized what was about to happen. This wasn't just a passenger. This was the owner of the airline, and Karen had just destroyed her own career. Climax. The shocking event. The beginning of the downfall. The captain had ordered the entire flight crew to be summoned. Passengers were in a state of shock. Some gasped, some froze, while others raised their phones to record. Karen Sterling stood motionless. She knew something was wrong. Alexis Carter sat comfortably in her first-class seat, unbothered, showing not a hint of concern. She knew exactly what was about to happen. The first-class cabin door suddenly opened, and Captain Jeffrey Reynolds stepped in with a grim expression. He did not greet the passengers as he usually would. He did not offer a polite smile. Instead, he walked straight up to Karen, his eyes cold as ice, as if he already understood the entire situation. "Flight attendant Karen Sterling, come with me, right now." Karen went pale. I'm just doing my job," she stammered, her voice wavering. The captain was not interested in excuses. "You've done enough." He turned to Alexis, nodding respectfully. "Ms. Carter, we sincerely apologize for this inconvenience. I assure you this issue will be resolved immediately." The cabin fell into complete silence. At that moment, a voice echoed through the plane's PA system. "Security personnel are waiting at the arrival gate. All passengers, please remain in your seats." Karen felt like she couldn't breathe. She knew something had gone terribly wrong. Alexis calmly reached for the glass of water she had requested earlier, took a small, deliberate sip, then placed it back down with authority. Then she looked up at Karen. "I gave you a chance to do the right thing. You refused." Karen stood frozen. Some passengers began whispering. Mrs. Winslow glanced at Alexis nervously, no longer daring to show her earlier arrogance. The young businessman across the aisle shook his head, disappointment clear in his eyes. Mrs. Sterling, the captain continued, his voice as sharp as steel, you are officially suspended from duty, effective immediately. Karen blinked in shock. Suspended? The captain was firm. You have violated the airline's code of conduct. Karen felt like the world was spinning around her. She wanted to argue. She wanted to scream that this was all a misunderstanding. But the looks from the captain, the passengers, and especially Alexis Carter, left no room for escape. The truth comes to light. Minutes later, a media frenzy had erupted on the plane. Passengers were posting videos of the confrontation. A racist flight attendant just got suspended mid-flight. First-class passenger exposes shocking discrimination. Clips spread like wildfire. And then the biggest bombshell dropped. A young passenger quickly Googled something on his phone. In just seconds, his eyes widened in shock. Wait, do you guys know who she is? All eyes turned to him. She's Alexis Carter, the majority shareholder of this airline. A wave of gas swept through the cabin. Even those who had ignored the situation earlier suddenly sat up straight. Karen felt the blood drain from her face. What? What? Alexis locked eyes with her, her voice powerful but controlled. Who did you think I was when you decided to humiliate me? Karen Sterling's fall from grace. Karen couldn't breathe. She had dug her own grave. Every action she took was recorded. Every word she spoke was evidence against her. The captain gave a final order. Miss Sterling, you will be escorted off this aircraft upon landing. Your belongings will be sent back separately. Karen panicked. No, I've worked for this airline for 10 years. I was just following policy. The captain did not waver. You weren't following policy. You abused your authority and humiliated a passenger, and that is inexcusable. Karen turned to Alexis, pleading with her eyes. Miss Carter, please. Alexis smirked. I have nothing more to say to you. Landing and the nightmare's end. Once the plane landed, 2 security officers were waiting at the aircraft's entrance. Karen shook violently. As she was escorted off the plane, every passenger watched. Some silently recorded the moment. Others shook their heads in disapproval. The businessmen clapped lightly. Mrs. Winslow lowered her head, not daring to look at anyone. And just as Karen disappeared down the aisle, a round of applause erupted. The price of discrimination. The incident became front-page news across all media outlets. Headlines exploded. Flight attendant fired mid-flight for racial discrimination. Airline shareholder humiliated on her own flight. The shocking outcome. Alexis Carter had not only restored her dignity, she had set a precedent. Days later, the airline issued an official statement. We do not tolerate any form of discrimination. We are implementing immediate training reforms to ensure this never happens again. Alexis sat in her office, scrolling through the news headlines, calmly sipping her coffee. The situation was handled, and she had won. Consequences. Justice is served. The aftermath begins. The moment the plane landed, a storm was waiting. Karen Sterling, the disgraced flight attendant, had barely stepped off the aircraft when she was immediately met by security personnel. Miss Sterling, you are to come with us, one officer said, his tone firm but professional. Passengers, who had remained silent during the flight, now watched with satisfaction as Karen's downfall unfolded before their eyes. Some whispered, others snapped pictures, but the judgment in their eyes was louder than any words. Karen's face was ghostly pale. This is ridiculous, she mumbled, her arrogance now gone. But no one rushed to her defense. No one spoke up for her. Because now everyone knew the truth. Karen had been caught. She had humiliated a passenger. And worse, she had humiliated the wrong passenger. The internet reacts within minutes of the landing. Videos from the flight had gone viral. Social media exploded. Karen Sterling, the racist flight attendant who got what she deserved. Elite passenger exposes airline's dirty secret, discrimination in first class. Justice mid-flight, woman denied her seat, ends up owning the airline. Comments poured in from around the world. I can't believe this. She treated a black woman like trash, only to find out she owns the airline? This is why people need to stop judging based on race. This was the definition of poetic justice. Imagine thinking you're better than someone and then realizing they can fire you on the spot. The entire world was now watching, and the airline had no choice but to act. Karen Sterling gets what she deserves. Just an hour after the plane landed, an official statement was released by the airline's CEO. We are appalled by the behavior displayed by one of our flight attendants. Effective immediately, Karen Sterling is terminated from our company. We sincerely apologize to Ms. Alexis Carter and promise to implement stricter anti-discrimination policies. The reaction was swift. The airline's stocks dipped. News channels picked up the story. Karen Sterling's face was everywhere, and not in the way she had ever imagined. Reporters swarmed the airport, hoping for a statement from her. But Karen had no words left to defend herself. She had lost everything in the span of just one flight. Alexis Carter's next move. Meanwhile, Alexis Carter walked calmly through the terminal, flanked by her personal security team. Unlike Karen, her confidence never wavered. She had handled the situation with grace. She had fought back without even raising her voice. And now she was ready to make real change. The next morning, Alexis sat in a high-rise office, sipping her espresso as she watched news reports flood every channel. Her legal team had already prepared a statement of their own. She posted it on her official social media account, where millions of people followed her. Discrimination has no place in any industry. As the majority shareholder of this airline, I am personally ensuring that every staff member undergoes mandatory anti-bias training. Furthermore, I will be launching an independent investigation into past discrimination complaints. The response was immediate. People praised her leadership. Major companies offered to partner with her. And most importantly, she had changed the conversation. This wasn't just about one racist flight attendant anymore. This was about holding an entire system accountable. Karen Sterling faces the ultimate consequence. For Karen Sterling, the nightmare was far from over. Her face was now a meme. People mocked her arrogance. Her past actions were being scrutinized. And then came the final blow. A former colleague came forward with a damning revelation. Karen Sterling had a history of profiling black passengers. This wasn't the first time she targeted someone unfairly. She's just finally facing consequences for it. More and more stories emerge. She humiliated my mother last year, too. I worked with her. She always treated people differently based on race. Good riddance. She deserved to be fired long ago. Karen was now completely unemployable. No airline wanted to touch her. She became the face of workplace racism. And worst of all, her former colleagues refused to defend her. She had lost everything, and she only had herself to blame. The airline's redemption. The airline knew it had one chance to recover, so, under Alexis Carter's direct oversight, they implemented mandatory racial sensitivity training for all employees, a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination, anonymous reporting systems for passengers and staff, a complete overhaul of their hiring process. Within weeks, passengers noticed the difference. The airline became known for its inclusivity, and Alexis, she became the most respected name in the aviation industry. She didn't just fight back, she changed the system. Karen Sterling's last attempt. Months later, Karen attempted one final act of desperation. She filed a lawsuit against the airline, claiming she had been wrongfully terminated. The case didn't even make it past the first hearing, because the evidence against her was overwhelming. She had humiliated herself. She had proven her own prejudice, and in the eyes of the world, she was forever labeled as the villain. The final victory. On a new flight, months later, Alexis Carter settled into her first-class seat. This time, there was no tension. No one questioned if she belonged there. The flight attendants greeted her with respect, not because she was rich, not because she was powerful, but because she was a passenger, and that was all that should ever matter. As she looked out the window, Alexis took a deep breath. This wasn't just a personal victory. This was a victory for every person who had ever been judged, mistreated, or told they didn't belong. And as the plane soared into the sky, she smiled. She had won, but more importantly, she had changed the game forever. What do you think? Does Karen deserve a second chance? Or did she get what she deserved? If you love stories like this, subscribe for more. Conclusion, a powerful message. The harsh reality of racism. Let's face the truth, racism hasn't disappeared. It has only changed its form, becoming more subtle, more concealed. Gone are the days of whites-only signs, but racism still exists in judgmental stares, dismissive tones, and exclusionary actions. What happened on that flight? A black woman was treated unfairly. A flight attendant discriminated against her without hesitation, and all because of one simple assumption: she doesn't belong here. How many times in your life have you witnessed or experienced something similar? A black person walks into a high-end restaurant, and the staff pretends not to notice them. An Asian professional is overlooked for a leadership position despite having the qualifications. A black shopper is closely monitored in a store because someone assumes they might steal. These are not small misunderstandings. They are symptoms of a deeply ingrained system where rights and dignity are often determined by the color of one's skin. Where does true power lie? Karen Sterling believed she had power. Why? Because she was white. Because she was the flight attendant in charge of that cabin. Because she thought a black woman could never belong in first class. She assumed she was in control. She thought she could command obedience. But true power does not come from false privilege. True power comes from truth. True power comes from justice. And the moment Alexis Carter stood up, without yelling, without arguing, but simply allowing the truth to unfold, Karen Sterling lost everything. The lesson here? False power crumbles when faced with reality. Those who misuse their positions to oppress others will never hold on to them forever. When indifference equals complicity, here's a hard truth. Indifference is the greatest weapon that allows racism to persist. Throughout that flight, many people witnessed the injustice. Some turned away, some whispered but did nothing. Some even thought Naomi deserved the treatment she got. Have you ever witnessed discrimination but chose to stay silent to avoid involvement? Have you ever stood by as someone was humiliated and thought, "That's not my problem"? Because that's how racism survives and continues. People like Karen Sterling exist because of the silence of those around them. But remember this: when you stay silent in the face of injustice, you are siding with the oppressor. The lesson: never be a bystander. If you see something wrong, speak up. Look in the mirror. After reading this story, ask yourself, have I treated everyone fairly? Have I ever judged someone unfairly based on their appearance? Have I ever avoided someone simply because they were different? Have I ever defended injustice by saying, "It's just the rules"? If the answer is yes, then now is the time to change. No one is born perfect, but we can learn and do better. Challenge the biases you were taught. And remember, no one belongs somewhere just because of their skin color. Everyone deserves to exist and be treated with dignity. Justice is not revenge. Alexis Carter did not scream. She did not demand personal vengeance. Instead, she used her power to create change. She didn't just fire Karen Sterling. She didn't just demand an apology, she changed an entire system. And that is true justice. Justice is not just punishing someone for doing wrong. Justice is making sure that wrong can never happen again. The lesson? If you have power, use it to help others. Don't just think about yourself. Think about the lasting impact of your actions. Which side will you choose? Ultimately, this story is not just about one flight. It is about all of us. It is about the small decisions we make every day. Will you look the other way, or will you speak up? Will you judge people by their character or by their skin color? Will you act when you see injustice, or will you remain silent? Remember, change doesn't just come from people in power. Change comes from each of us. And if there's one thing you should take away from this story, it's this. Never judge someone based on their appearance. Never stay silent in the face of injustice. And never forget that justice is not automatic. It must be fought for. Now the question is, how will you act? Think, act, and create change. Have you ever witnessed or experienced an injustice like this? Share your thoughts in the comments. If you agree that everyone deserves to be treated fairly, hit follow to never miss another powerful story.